In this section, we'll finish up our discussion of the endocrine system, and we'll be talking about the adrenal gland and the pancreas and a couple of other instances of endocrine secretion. So we said that the adrenal gland has an inner medulla, which releases epinephrine and norepinephrine upon sympathetic nervous system activation, and the outer cortex, which releases steroid hormones, corticosteroids. So let's start with the cortex. There's 3 regions of the adrenal cortex, and they secrete families of related compounds, and there's actually this kind of a little bit of overlapping function, but the main point is the outer zona glomerulosa releases primarily aldosterone. It's called a mineralocorticoid because it regulates sodium and potassium levels. It's that mineralo word in there. But we're just going to refer to it as aldosterone from now on. The middle zona fasciculata of the cortex secretes glucocorticoids, mainly cortisol. And from now on, we'll just say cortisol, even though we're talking about glucocorticoids. Cortisol, one of its functions is to regulate blood glucose levels, and so hence the term glucocorticoid. All right, and then there's an inner zona reticularis, and I'll mention it, but not put a lot of stock in its importance physiologically. And here's a nice diagram showing you kind of the layout. We're looking in the adrenal gland. It looks like a little pyramid on top of the kidney. In the outer cortex, the inner part is this colorful part, the medulla. The outer cortex has the zona glomerulosa, which produces aldosterone, zona fasciculata that produces cortisol. So aldosterone first. What is up with aldosterone? Aldosterone is released in part by decreasing blood volume and blood pressure, and also by a rise in plasma potassium. Those are the 2 key things that really regulate the secretion, or I should say activate the secretion of aldosterone. I'll make another summary slide next about overall what regulates the secretion. But the main things to remember that stimulate its release are decreasing blood volume and blood pressure, particular blood pressure, that's the actual signal, and increasing in potassium. Potassium levels must be maintained, and if they increase due to some dietary consumption of potassium, it must be gotten rid of. And so we have a hormone whose major function is to get rid of that extra potassium. What does it do? What does aldosterone do once we get it out there? Well, it causes the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium chloride from what is becoming the urine. And when you actively reabsorb sodium chloride from that urine fluid back into the blood, it draws water by osmosis with it. So upshot is we're going to increase sodium retention and increase blood volume and blood pressure. We're going to retain water and sodium. If blood volume goes up, we said this morning, if blood volume goes up, blood pressure goes up. So signal, dropping blood pressure, restoration of blood pressure by aldosterone, by increasing blood volume. Also, while we're reabsorbing sodium chloride, we're going to secrete or get rid of potassium. Now, sometimes it's very confusing at this stage of the game to know when to say secrete or excrete. We're going to secrete potassium in some cells of the kidneys into the forming urine, and then we're going to excrete the urine from the body. So they're 2 different things, but anyway, we're going to get rid of excess potassium when aldosterone is present. Let me just summarize actually 4 different things that can impact, not just stimulate, but impact aldosterone secretion. So we said blood pressure going down. Well, what's going on there? The renin-angiotensin system, or renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, is invoked. The kidneys have their own blood pressure sensor. And when blood pressure goes down, kidneys release an enzyme called renin. Sometimes people refer to it as a hormone. It is not a hormone. It's an enzyme which acts on a plasma protein that is already present in inactive form to produce angiotensin II. Angiotensin II causes aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex. So the cells of the zona glomerulosa will react to angiotensin II binding to its receptors and release aldosterone. Rising plasma potassium directly acts on the zona glomerulosa cells and they release aldosterone, right? We've got to get rid of that excess potassium. Finally, ACTH as a stimulus. If we have a lot of stress and we have adrenocorticotropic hormone coming out, right, we're going to have CRH coming from the hypothalamus, ACTH from the anterior pituitary gland. That's going to have a marginal impact on aldosterone. So if we're getting stressed, we're going to raise aldosterone, increase blood volume, and blood pressure allow us to address or rise to the challenge. Okay, one more thing though. There's a check and balance system for aldosterone and for just in general the kidneys function in this area. When the atria of the heart become more stretched, if you have an elevated blood volume, that blood is going to wind up coming back to the heart through the veins, stretch those atria on the top of the heart, and then when they stretch, they release a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide, and it inhibits aldosterone. Right? If we already have too much blood volume, we don't want to let more and more aldosterone come out. It's sort of a limit on these kinds of systems to keep elevating aldosterone and blood volume. So we'll block aldosterone function and aldosterone release, and it also directly inhibits the reabsorption of salt and water in the kidneys. So it blocks aldosterone, which would promote salt and water reabsorption, and it directly blocks those functions. So it's a check and balance. It's an anti-aldosterone, if you will. Here's a little diagram showing all those same things. If the blood volume and blood pressure go down, excuse me, kidneys release renin. Renin converts a plasma protein into angiotensin II, and angiotensin II goes right over to the zona glomerulosa and causes aldosterone release, and aldosterone causes to retain salt and water, increase blood volume and blood pressure. Excess potassium in the blood talks right to those zona glomerulosa cells, increase aldosterone, and excrete potassium, get rid of that excess potassium. Stress. If you have stress, it causes CRH release from the hypothalamus, ACTH from the anterior pituitary gland. That causes the zona glomerulosa to release aldosterone. A check and balance, a inhibitor. I should draw maybe a line right through here, a vertical line. If the blood volume and pressure increase, the atria of the heart release atrial natriuretic peptide, which blocks aldosterone release and inhibits sodium and water reabsorption in the kidney, so that we can kind of limit that process. Okay. What if we have too much aldosterone? We have a tumor that's producing aldosterone, all the things that you would expect. If aldosterone causes an increase in blood volume and blood pressure, we're going to have excess blood pressure, hypertension. When you have hypertension, when blood pressure rises, fluid starts leaking from the blood vessels into the tissues, and if it builds up there, that's called edema. It makes someone look puffy, like their skin feel like dough. So that's called edema. If we have too much aldosterone, we're also going to have excess sodium in the body. So we have a lot of extra sodium, excess water, high blood pressure. We're going to have insufficient potassium, and that can be lethal. If we keep on sending out too much aldosterone, we're going to keep excreting a lot of potassium, and we're going to have some problems with respect to electrically active cells like neurons and muscle cells, heart muscle cells. Big problem. Okay, that's the story for aldosterone. Let's look at cortisol, the glucocorticoid from the zona fasciculata. ACTH is its main stimulus. CRH to ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary, causes cortisol release. And its levels are regulated by negative feedback, so it stays kind of constant. It has a fairly wide swing, day-night or diurnal swing. But it's also elevated in times of stress or intense exercise. So it's hence called the stress hormone. When you need to rise to the occasion due to some stress and do something, you need cortisol to help you do it. It'll provide. We'll see what it does in a second. What are its functions? It's going to release glucose into the blood from the liver. Right? That's the fuel for all of our tissues, our exercising muscles. Right? We're going to rise to some occasion. Fatty acids are going to be released from adipose tissue and by cortisol. So that's, again, another fuel for energy production in muscles, in the heart, and so forth. It's going to raise, this is how it's going to raise blood glucose. I know I said it's going to raise blood glucose glibly. Let's take a look at the ways that it actually works. It causes the liver to break down stored glucose in the form of glycogen. Glycogen is a polymer of glucose. It's just thousands of glucose molecules all fastened together in a tree-like structure, and is stored in the liver cells. And when cortisol comes out, we break that glucose, that glycogen, back down to glucose, let it out into the blood in order to give some fuel for exercises. Gluconeogenesis. The liver cells have the unique ability to synthesize new glucose molecules from non-carbohydrate sources. In other words, from glycerol, which comes from fat breakdown, and from amino acids, protein breakdown. Cortisol causes protein breakdown and release of amino acids into the blood. Lipolysis. That means going to the adipose tissue where there's fat stored and breaking that fat down and releasing fatty acids and glycerol into the blood. Now, fatty acids are a wonderful energy source for working muscles, and when they have fat available, fatty acids, they won't use as much glucose. They'll take the fatty acids in part. So it's a way of sparing glucose. So therefore, if we have a lot of extra fatty acids coming out, then we'll use the glucose up less quickly, and so glucose will be supported. So we got mobilization of fuels for exercise. It's one big thing that cortisol does. It also breaks down protein. I should have mentioned before, but I don't think I did, that growth hormone also mobilizes fuels for exercise. We said it's released during exercise, but it promotes protein synthesis, building, and adapting to exercise. Cortisol is more of an emergency kind of a hormone. Say, hey man, we need all these fuels for exercise. We're gonna sacrifice a little bit of protein. Another important function of cortisol is to enhance the functions, the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine, including things like vasoconstriction, which raises blood pressure, increasing heart function, which raises blood pressure. Cortisol also inhibits inflammation and immune system activity, right? Suppresses inflammation and suppresses the immune system, right? If we're trying to do something drastic and responding to some challenge, we can worry about those functions of the body later. We don't want them holding us back. And we don't want it, pain and soreness and fluid buildup. We're just going to do what we need to do, and we'll worry about those things later. So those are the functions I'd like you to remember about cortisol. You can see it's a complex and powerful hormone. Cushing's syndrome is what we call when there's too much cortisol in the body. What if that cortisol is coming from outside the body? The most common cause of Cushing's syndrome is from exogenous sources, corticosteroid drugs. Amazingly, drugs have been designed that take advantage of these functions of cortisol, drugs that work like cortisol, that inhibit inflammation and immune system activity. If you have a joint injury, for example, you may, or inflammation, arthritis, you may have a cortisone injection. It will help suppress that inflammation and pain. If you have an organ transplant, you will probably be taking prednisone, another cortisol-like drug, in order to suppress the rejection of the organ, of that freshly implanted organ. People with chronic inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis use corticosteroids to suppress that painful inflammation in the joints. Endogenous, meaning from within the body. There could be hypersecretion of cortisol, and there could be a tumor in the pituitary gland releasing ACTH in excess, right? And that's going to go down there and talk to the zona fasciculata and cause the release of cortisol. What if there was an actual tumor right in the adrenal cortex? Then you might have excess cortisol production. So those are some causes of Cushing's syndrome. What's going to happen? All those functions of cortisol. You're going to have elevated blood glucose, hyperglycemia, elevated blood lipids or fat, hyperlipidemia. That's going to contribute to atherosclerosis. Hypertension, high blood pressure, because we're accelerating the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine, increased heart rate, increased vasoconstriction and heart function. It's also going to disrupt gastrointestinal function. It's going to depress cartilage and bone formation, so that's bad. Right? We don't want to lose cartilage as we age. We lose joint cartilage already as it is, and we don't want to accelerate that process. These are kind of bad things in chronic form. Inhibition of inflammation and immune system function. We may be more susceptible to illness if we have Cushing's syndrome. Some just quirky things. We have redistribution of fat from the extremities to the torso, so like a corpulent torso with chicken legs and arms, and also the appearance of fat on the back of the shoulders, nicknamed buffalo hump. And also people with Cushing's syndrome typically have like a swelled up round face, and you can find lots of pictures online, before and after pictures of people before and after chronic administration of corticosteroids. You can see how their face just sort of becomes plump and round after that. Moon face, it's called. What if you don't have enough cortisol release? Well, usually when that happens, it's not just cortisol, but it's the entire cortex that fails, and so you have Addison's disease, and we have reduced blood glucose, right? You can't support the blood glucose levels when it starts to go down as well. We have insufficient sodium levels in the body. Hypokalemia, or hyponatremia, I'm sorry. Hyperkalemia, too much potassium. You see the K for potassium in there, hyperkalemia, which is, again, very bad. You can't have too much potassium. You have to manage that somehow. Severe dehydration. We're not able to reabsorb the sodium and water as we should in the kidneys, so we're going to pee out too much water and have dehydration, hypotension, and weight loss. So Cushing's syndrome is common, again, because of drugs that we use very effectively for certain situations, but there's side effects. And all medical treatments involve some risk or some side effects. You can see Mrs. Cushing here before she started with her chemotherapy regimen, her anti-inflammatory regimen, and here you can see her a little bit later with her more puffy-looking face and her buffalo hump. There's a third part of the adrenal cortex called the zona. It's escaping me now. Anyway, so the inner part, I'm sorry, where the gonadocorticoids come out. I don't say it very much because I don't believe it has a physiological role, none that's been discovered so far. There's a number of theories that are often purported to be the factual function of the sex hormones released from the kidneys, or from the adrenal gland, I'm sorry. None of them have been borne out by ongoing research, so I wouldn't worry about them at all. I wouldn't even worry about the fact that gonadocorticoids come from, or sex hormones come from the adrenal glands, except in cases where there's excess production. Excess male hormones is basically what you're talking about. Testosterone-like hormones causes masculinization, right? All the secondary sex characteristics of male, hirsutism, excess hair growth in females. In boys, if they have excess sex steroids production, you're not really going to notice much, except perhaps a precocious or early advent of sexual maturity. But in women, especially if it happens in the uterus and in development, it can cause androgenital syndrome, it's called. That's a situation where the genitals don't form properly, and the clitoris may be enlarged, because it's like the body thinks it's supposed to be making male genitalia. The labia may be fused like a small scrotum, and surgery may be required. It's complicated. But in girls in general, you're going to have hirsutism, extra hair growth, beard growth, and so forth. So that's when it might be worth recognizing that there is such a situation, such an origin of male hormones. How about the inner adrenal medulla? That's where epinephrine and norepinephrine come from. When the sympathetic nervous system is turned on, chromaffin cells are the source. Just the name of them. Don't worry about that so much. So the normal effects are the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. Vasoconstriction, which drives up blood pressure, It helps us perform in physical activities. Increased heart rate and heart force of contraction. In other words, more blood delivery to all the organs of the body during exercise. This should say also increase in heart output in general. Increase in fuels for exercise. So epinephrine and norepinephrine also cause mobilization of glucose by the same mechanisms we just talked about, and immobilization of fatty acids from the adipose tissue. How important are those fuels? We have now 3 hormones that cause their release: growth hormone, cortisol, and these so-called catecholamines. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are called catecholamines. So these are really important functions in order to allow the body. These are the changes that take place during exercise, and if it weren't for this, the sympathetic nervous system, we wouldn't be able to exercise effectively. If there's too much coming out, though, we have a condition called Pheochromocytoma. A tumor in the adrenal medulla would cause too much epinephrine to be released, and we'd have all the functions of catecholamines in excess. Hyperglycemia, hypertension, raising the blood pressure too much all the time. Increase in metabolism. These hormones also cause an increase in metabolic activity in your cells. So we're going to have excess metabolism. We're going to have sweating, right? The sympathetic nervous system controls sweat release. We're going to have just random sweating, nervousness, jitteriness. Pallor means kind of a pale appearance if you have fair skin because of vasoconstriction, less blood that's visible in the skin. Hyposecretion is not essential for life, but without catecholamines, you can't rise to the occasion, you can't exercise comfortably in the same way because you don't have those changes taking place in your body. Delivery of blood full of fuels for ATP production. So here's a neat little summary of the adrenal gland function. In the short term, under conditions of stress, the sympathetic nervous system gets activated. Catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine come out, drive up blood pressure and blood delivery, increase fuels for exercise. Longer term stress, corticotropin releasing hormone comes from the hypothalamus, ACTH from the anterior pituitary gland, and cortisol and aldosterone come out, and we have increase in fuels for exercise, increase in blood pressure and blood delivery, suppression of inflammation, suppression of the immune system function, and then also increasing blood volume and therefore blood pressure because of retaining sodium and water. And those are all things that help with athletic performance, your body's ability to do what it needs to do in a stressful situation. The pineal gland is part of the epithalamus, part of your brain we talked about, and if you don't know what that is, it's okay. Just go back and look in chapter 12 of your book real quick back and maybe look in the index under pineal gland and get a quick rundown. But it produces melatonin, which is a hormone that is thought to have to do with maintaining sleep, so helping you maintain healthy day-night cycles. Sometimes people take melatonin to fall asleep, but I think that's a misguided strategy. I think melatonin is more about staying asleep than it is about transitioning to sleep. But anyway, that's kind of what it's known for. The pancreas, one more super important hormone secreting organ. The pancreas is largely an exocrine gland. And it releases all the enzymes needed inside your intestines to digest the food you eat. It releases all the enzymes to break down proteins, polysaccharides, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and fats. And then you can absorb them and make use of all those raw materials. So that's the main function, probably in terms of volume of your pancreas. We'll get more functions of that later in another chapter. But the islets of Langerhans are little blobs of endocrine tissue that contain cells called alpha and beta cells that release the hormones. That's the endocrine function of the pancreas. So beta cells release insulin, and alpha cells release glucagon, its antagonist. And here's a micrograph showing an islet of Langerhans. Around here you see lots of simple cuboidal cells arranged in little spheres, secretory units that produce the enzymes for digestion and produce some bicarbonate ion to neutralize stomach acid. But here is an islet of Langerhans, and we have alpha and beta cells in there that release our hormones. So insulin, let's quickly tackle that. I think you probably know quite a bit about insulin. It is released when blood glucose rises or other nutrients that come into the blood after a meal. You digest and absorb, insulin comes out from the beta cells in the islets. Insulin allows us to take up the glucose by cells of your body. It promotes taking up glucose and fat and amino acids, and it promotes storing of glucose as well, right? So we're going to take up the glucose into the cells, store it as fat. We can convert glucose readily into fatty acids and store it in the adipose tissue and in muscles. We're going to store glucose as glycogen in the liver. So insulin is all about, in the time of plenty after a meal, we're going to absorb all these nutrients and store them away for later. We're going to make fat and glycogen and take the glucose out of the blood and keep our glucose levels constant in the body. I mean, this glucose level is going to rise after a meal and then it's going to go right back down to normal because of insulin. Glucagon is released during fasting. So when you're not eating, your cells are continuing to metabolize, your whole nervous system is eating up glucose molecules, glucose levels start to go down. What happens? Glucagon comes out, and glucagon causes the release of glucose into the blood. It elevates blood glucose and fatty acids. Wow, a fourth hormone that's involved in mobilizing those fuels. So the major storage place of glucose in your body is in the liver, that we said it's glycogen. We're going to break down that glycogen and release the glucose back out into the blood, raises blood glucose levels, or maintains them, let's say. How does it work? The same way we talked about. Glycogenolysis, breaking down glycogen to release glucose. Gluconeogenesis, making new glucose molecules from amino acids and glycerol. And also releasing fatty acids from the adipose tissue, both because it's such a good source of energy, but that also spares glucose, so that the muscle cells don't use up all the glucose, while the brain and the nervous system would much rather have that glucose. They're not big on fatty acid metabolism. How does it work? It works by a tyrosine kinase mechanism. We don't need to worry too much about that, but its receptor is called a tyrosine kinase. When insulin binds with receptors, a kinase phosphorylates, adds phosphates from ATP onto the receptor itself and then onto some other proteins and triggers some signaling. Just like we talked about at the beginning of the chapter, some second messenger cascades. Now we're going to have some signaling cascades initiated by tyrosine kinase activity. But that's probably not super important to memorize, but the main thing to know is that that insulin will activate cell uptake of glucose by causing the cells to produce more glucose transporters to capture the glucose, and storing it as fat, and storing it as glycogen in the liver, converting glucose to fat to store in the liver, also converting fatty acids being taken up into the fat to be stored away. Fatty acids are like broken down fats, and we can reassemble them into triglycerides, fat, and adipocytes. So here's a little negative feedback regulation scheme to illustrate these processes once again. If blood glucose goes up after a meal, pancreas, the islets release insulin. Insulin causes the cells to take up glucose for their own use, causes the liver to store glucose as glycogen, causes the adipocytes to store glucose as fat, and blood glucose falls back down to normal. 90 milligrams per deciliter per 100 mils of blood. If blood glucose goes down during fasting when you haven't been eating, glucagon comes out and causes the liver to release that glucose back out into the blood, make new glucose to release out into the blood so we can support the blood glucose levels. But also, glucagon causes fatty acid release from the fat tissue, and that should be shown here too. This is sort of redundant what we've already said, so we don't really need to say too much about this. What causes insulin to be released? This is worth saying though. The parasympathetic nervous system is part of the involuntary or autonomic nervous system. You can check that out in chapter 14 if you're not very sharp on that anymore. It's a very short chapter, very interesting. Anyway, parasympathetic nervous system controls digestion. And so when you eat a meal, parasympathetic nervous system is going to be cranked up. That's what turns on a lot of the digestive processes. Well, it also causes insulin release, right? We're about to have a bunch of nutrients coming in the blood. Let's get ready to store those things away for later and allow the cells to take up glucose and so forth. It's inhibited by glucagon, of course. It's antagonist. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are all about exercise. They inhibit insulin. They're anti-insulin. All right, we come to diabetes mellitus. We talked about diabetes insipidus, in which there's not enough ADH and we have a lot of urine production because we can't reabsorb water. Now we have diabetes mellitus, in which we have a lot of urine production. Why is that? Well, diabetes mellitus results from either hyposecretion of insulin, that's called type 1 diabetes. Your islets of Langerhans have been killed, or at least the beta cells. Or hypoactivity. When you gain weight through adipose tissue, you become resistant to insulin. The tissues stop taking up glucose in response to insulin for some reason. That's called type 2 diabetes. In either case, you're going to have hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia means too much insulin or too much glucose in the blood. You're going to have high blood glucose than usual because of the cells can't take up the glucose. And that can activate the sympathetic nervous system, trying to deal with that problem. Glucosuria. That means that if you have excess glucose in your blood, where does urine come from? It comes from the blood. We'll talk a lot more about that in another chapter. But if there's too much glucose in the blood, there's going to be glucose in the urine. There should be no glucose in the urine. It's going to be in there because it's just spilling over in the kidneys. Can't get it all reabsorbed. Diabetes mellitus, because of the activation of other hormones, is going to result in hyperlipidemia. There's going to be too much fatty acids in the blood, and it's going to cause atherosclerosis, vascular disease. This is a horrible, horrible disease. It causes destruction of the body in so many ways. But one key thing is by accelerated vascular or blood vessel disease, atherosclerosis, and it leads to all kinds of things, peripheral circulation problems, blindness, all kind of stuff happens as a result. Amputations ultimately of extremities, usually feet, because of loss of peripheral circulation because of vascular disease. Ketones are a remedy for energy sources when the cells can't take up glucose. The liver, during a period of insufficient insulin production, will start predominantly oxidizing fatty acids, and when there's excess fatty acid metabolism, we'll wind up with ketones or keto acids coming from the liver into the blood. I think this is important to know. This might sound like a little bit obscure. It's not. Ketones come into the blood from the liver when there's insufficient carbohydrates, or the cells can't get the carbohydrates in this case, and so we're going to have ketoacidosis. The ketone bodies are acidic, and acidosis is a very serious condition. So if you have too much ketone production, you'll have ketoacidosis. Not good. That's what diabetics have. And also, these products have a fruity smell. And so one of the key sort of hallmarks of diabetes mellitus is someone with this strange fruity smell to their body. If you have ketoacidosis, it'll cause an increase in ventilation or breathing. It'll interfere with your heart function, which is obviously very bad, and oxygen transport to your body, not good things. It'll impair nervous system function, and if it's too severe, you can die from it. So ketoacidosis is bad. Why do I dislike keto diets? What are you doing? You're playing with this kind of situation. You're trying to purposely reduce carbohydrates so much that your liver starts producing ketone bodies. Yes, normally in a keto diet, you don't get so carried away that you get into ketoacidosis, but it just seems like an overly harsh way to treat your body. If you do it in moderate amounts, it's fine. So, hallmarks of diabetes mellitus: polyuria. We have excess urine production, and that's because that glucose that spills over into the urine causes us to not be able to reabsorb as much water by osmosis. It acts like a diuretic, it's called. So we're going to have excess urine production when we have glucose in the urine. So polyuria, excess urine. Polydipsia. If you're dehydrated all the time, which you are going to be, your hypothalamus will respond by making you thirsty. You'll drink a lot of water. You'll pee a lot. You'll drink a lot. Those are hallmarks also of diabetes insipidus, but in this case we have glucose in the urine, which is different. Polyphagia. Hormone productions will cause you to be hungry, and your hypothalamus will make you feel hungry. The cells can't take up glucose, and so the presumption is that you're starving. You don't have enough raw materials coming in, and so you'll just be hungry and eating all the time. What if you had too much insulin? Well, you wouldn't have too much insulin unless you injected too much insulin. What's going to happen? You're going to have hypoglycemia. So you could actually have such severe hypoglycemia, you could have convulsions and coma and death. If your blood glucose levels drop suddenly, your nervous system cannot adapt. There's no fuel for the neurons to do what they do, and your brain shuts down and you die. It's called insulin shock. Usually, the reason this would occur probably was from a former era before automatic pumps, injection pumps that you can implant in the body or attach to the body for secreting insulin for diabetics. People used to have to just manually inject themselves with insulin, right? So every time you were about to have a meal, you would inject yourself with a bolus of insulin so that when you eat up all your carbohydrates at dinner and you absorb all the glucose into the blood, it can be swept away into the cells by the insulin. Well, in the unusual circumstance that you made the insulin injection, but then were somehow prevented from getting to the meal, then you're in deep trouble because that insulin is going to sweep away all the glucose in your blood, and you could die from hypoglycemia, from the insulin shock. For example, let's say you had a car accident on your way to some place where you're going to eat. You'd already injected your insulin, so things like that. If someone is experiencing hypoglycemia, usually people that are diabetic have on their person some candy. And if you think someone is having such an episode, you may want to look around in their bag or whatever for candy bars, because that may very well be what's happening. They're having an attack with too much insulin. I'm going to skip over the slide, which just repeats everything we just said about that. We're not going to talk about the gonads other than to say that they produce the sex steroids, estrogen and progesterone, to control and maintain the secondary sex characteristics and fertility of men and women, mature men and women. Estrogen and progesterone are the hormones that control the menstrual cycle and the preparation of the uterus for implantation of a fertilized ovum. The whole story is something that we're not going to get into in this chapter, unfortunately. There's a whole other chapter in your book on the process, and we're not going to be able to get to that chapter just because we have too much on our plate already. And I have tried it before. It's a complicated chapter, and it's a wonderful chapter, but it'll dilute other things that we're doing, and it'll bring us into an area where if you really want to learn about that, you should be taking probably an OBGYN course. Or read it for yourself. It's very fascinating. So again, testes produce testosterone, which are responsible for secondary sex characteristics in males. And what do we have a separate slide for ovaries? Yeah, ovaries. Good. Equal time. All right. Lastly, or nearly lastly, adipose tissue has just recently been discovered to produce several hormones, and they're not really well understood. But the whole regulation of our hunger and satiety, our desire for intake of calories, and our sense that we've already taken enough. It's a careful balance of the multiple systems of your body, and multiple hormones that are produced by your adipose tissue are part of it. Hypothalamus is part of it. So leptin is a hormone that comes out as you continue to take on more and more calories. You keep eating, you start storing more nutrients. It starts to shut off your hunger response. It starts to increase your energy expenditure, right? We got plenty of resources here. We can afford to go ahead and burn some. Resistin and adiponectin are a couple of hormones from the fat. I'm not going to say much about it because they're really not well understood. There's lots of conflicting research findings and so forth, so you can read about that a little bit if you want to. Your heart, we already said, produces atrial natriuretic peptide, a hormone that inhibits aldosterone and inhibits sodium and water reabsorption in the kidneys, and therefore lowers blood volume and blood pressure. Last thing about the kidneys, though, real quick. The kidneys release erythropoietin. Say that, erythropoietin. It's a very strange word. Erythropoietin is the signal for red blood cell production in your red bone marrow. All your red blood cells, which you desperately need in your blood to carry oxygen, the level is maintained of red blood cells and hemoglobin by this hormone from the kidneys. If they become hypoxic, not enough oxygen, they'll release erythropoietin and we'll have more red blood cells to carry oxygen. Renin is not a hormone. The intestinal system has lots of endocrine cells that help regulate digestion. We'll talk about that in another chapter. I think that's probably good for us for today. Thymus, we won't talk about that until we get to the immune system, chapter 21. We'll make very little remark about the thymus as well in that chapter, but we will make some assessments of its function then. All right, so that's the end of our discussion of the endocrine system. I know this is a little longer this time, and I just wanted to get in some good description of the function of these hormones. And if you have any questions, let me know. If I confused you in any way, we want to really make this chapter a good one and one that you know very well. Endocrine system is very important, and I think oftentimes it's a little bit tricky to get a handle on. So I'm here to take any questions or clarify anything as needed.